Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we'll be picking up right where we left off with necessities and luxuries. So, just as a quick refresher, we saw how our definition of necessity and luxury was chosen specifically so that a necessity would be a good for which increasing the price increases the expenditure, while a luxury would be a good for which increasing the price reduces the expenditure. And now we're going to see several interesting scenarios that result from this concept. How we can actually use even very basic economic theory to yield very counterintuitive results. So here's your first one. Everyone knows that businesses would like to raise their prices if they can. But the only thing that keeps them from doing it is competition. In a competitive market, businesses are what we call price takers. You have the right to set whatever price you want in a capitalist society, notwithstanding like price ceilings, which we'll talk about in a few lectures. You have the legal ability to charge a certain price, but you have no legal ability to force people to buy from you. And so if you sell a good that is equivalent in every way to someone else's good, but they charge less than you, everyone's going to go to your competition. And because of this, prices are forced down. Now, what may be a little more surprising is that that's not the only way that prices can be forced down. See, that whole premise that you would like to raise the price as a producer is based on an implicit assumption that we're talking about a necessity. But with the luxury, what happens when you raise the price? It lowers the spending level. Now, what do you care about as a businessman? Profits, revenues minus costs. And your revenues are your customers' expenditures. So if they're spending less, you're making less. And so the producer of a luxury actually would rather reduce the price. Now, I know from experience that this puts some people into a tizzy. They get very aggravated or sarcastic because they start to point out very expensive luxury items. But keep in mind, firstly, didn't I tell you, a good becomes more of a luxury as you raise its price. Its elasticity goes up. Because what we think of as necessities and luxuries depends on our circumstances. You think of that thing as a luxury, you treat it as a luxury precisely because it's so expensive. And why is it so expensive in the first place? Well, it could be that the company is keeping the price up, but it could also be that it genuinely costs that much to produce. Oftentimes, if a product is considered particularly desirable, it's considered desirable because it's of finer workmanship, or it's made from finer materials. Well, if something is handmade, or even if it's just made more carefully, that means it's going to take more labor, and it's going to take higher quality labor, and that costs more money. If something is made of finer materials, well, very often that means that the materials themselves took more labor to make, or the materials are more rare, or just have some other condition that makes them more expensive. You know, plastic is very easy to make. And we mix a lot of plastic into our clothes. It goes by different names, but you know, you look on the tag on your shirt, you'll find all kinds of inorganic chemicals in it. Cotton It's a little more expensive. If you want something made entirely from cotton, then you're going to pay up. Takes land to grow cotton, takes a lot of water to grow cotton. But that cotton shirt is still going to be a heck of a lot cheaper than a silk shirt. Because for a silk shirt, you have to gather the cocoons of silkworms and boil them and then weave them into thread. It is a much more labor intensive process, and it can only take place in certain places as well. It requires special inputs like mulberry leaves for the silkworms to feed off of. When things are luxuries, there's usually a reason why they're a luxury. It's not generally pure greed. And sure, brand name recognition can play a role as well. There are brands which face an incentive to keep their price up because the exclusivity of the brand is what makes it attractive. Yet, how did that brand become exclusive in the first place? Nobody just goes out, starts a business, starts selling cheap garbage, and says, oh, but my cheap garbage is prestigious. No, it became prestigious because of some feature it had, even if the quality has waned at some point. See, one of the things that economists and businessmen often understand that the general public doesn't is that you don't get rich in this life selling luxuries to rich people. You get rich selling luxuries to poor people. Joseph Schumpeter summed it up in a I think, fairly elegant quote. The capitalist achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stocking for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls in return for a steadily decreasing amount of effort. A man can make a good living selling luxuries to a small group of people. But folks like that, they never really hit the big time. They don't become robber barons. They don't become captains of industry. And the businesses they run don't become mega corporations. But when someone finds a way to reduce the cost, to make it to where they can offer the thing for cheaper than they currently are, and in doing so, reach more consumers, that's where true fortunes come from. Because even though they may be selling it for less, they're selling it to a far, far greater number of people and on a far, far greater scale. The ultimate example of that would be Henry Ford and his Model T. Understand, Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. Automobiles had been made and sold for decades before he came along. They actually start to come along. I think the earliest one might have been the 1870s. But they were toys for rich men. European aristocrats, other robber barons, were the ones that were driving these things. What does Henry Ford do? Well, he took his inspiration from the meatpacking plants in Chicago. He saw how they had a process set up where a cow carcass would be rolled into the facility, and then each man would have his own job on the line. And they were very skilled at their job because they trained at just one thing. And the line was set up to move along at a certain pace. The workforce was regimented. And so they were able to tear apart a cow carcass in a matter of minutes that might have taken an individual farmer, say, an hour. I made that up. I don't know the exact time it took, but this is a real story with the cattle industry. Well, Henry Ford, he sees this and a light goes off in his head. He thinks, if we can take something apart that way, we can put it back together that way. Or put it together the first time that way. And he applies this to manufacturing. He's one of the first people to do it. The assembly line, the modern factory with modern scientific management. See, before Henry Ford, these cars are super expensive because they're being made by craftsmen. You actually have individual, mom and pops auto factory run out of their garage where they're building a car piece by piece in the same way that people used to build wagons bit by bit. Henry Ford finds a faster way to do it. Way, way faster. Which means that even though he has huge facilities, thousands of employees in a facility, he's still able to make it cheaper because they're just that good that they can make that many in such a short amount of time. Now, that alone would have been good business. That alone would have been good sense. He can sell the car at the same price and sell them, but it costs him far less to build it. So he's making a much higher profit per car. He could have kept his price the same. Or he could have lowered it just enough to run all those mom and pop shops out of business. But does he do it? No, he doesn't. Instead, what Henry Ford does is he starts to sell the cars for much cheaper, way cheaper than his rivals. Because he wanted cars to be affordable for everyone. And it wasn't out of the goodness of his heart he did this. Like, you get to looking up Henry Ford's personal life. He was a Nazi sympathizer. But Ford knew that he'd make much more of a fortune selling a car to everyone in America than he would selling a few very expensive cars to a few people. This applied to many different products, just about everything in your house. All of our appliances, a lot of the services we have now. Entrepreneurs found ways to do it cheaper than their rivals, not just to steal market share, but to bring more kinds of people into the market, to make it accessible to more people. And they didn't do it out of the goodness of their hearts. But selling democratically offered a lot more potential to them than selling to one small elite. Now, that's a happy story. That shows us how the logic of elasticity can actually result in improvements for society by making things more affordable, more accessible, more inclusive. But there are some ways in which the incentive structure can be flipped and you wind up with waste. So here's a scenario for you. Suppose you have a good that's a necessity, and it's very much a necessity. It has a very low elasticity score. And you want to sell it for a higher price. It would raise your profits a lot if you could sell it for a higher price. But in a competitive market, every man wants to undercut his rival and expand his market share. Everybody wants to jack their prices up, but they don't trust each other because they know that if any one guy charges less, everyone will just go to him. And you're brooding on this. Say you're a farmer. You really want to raise the price of your crops, but you just can't trust the other farmers. And you're barely scraping by. And you just really wish that like a tornado would come along or a storm would come along or a blight would come along and just wipe out some of the crop, destroy some of your stock. You don't want it to happen just to you. If it happens just to you, then you're worse off. But if it were to happen to everyone, it would get some of this quantity off the market and you could charge a much higher price, all of you could, and your profits would go up. You wish that a disaster would destroy your goods if it would destroy everyone else's goods with it. Well, does that sound unrealistic? You're thinking, I don't know if I believe this. This sounds like some bullshit out of, out of a textbook, out of theory. Well, it's real. It is real. And it has happened many times throughout the ages. The saddest, bitterest thing of all, from the Great Depression to today, a long history of food destruction in the face of hunger. Tons of carrots dumped to rot by a local farmer in Ukraine on May 18 upon failing to sell it amid the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This has played itself out in somewhat different ways in different places, but very often the government actually pays farmers to destroy crops. Sometimes, thankfully, they'll just pay them to not plant the crop in the first place. It's more efficient. But especially in times of need, they have paid them to destroy crops, even when there were hungry people on the streets looking for work. They did this during COVID-19. They did this during the Great Depression. They would kill live pigs just to throw the meat away while there were people dying of starvation. And this even inspired one of the most famous passages of American literature, which I'm going to share with you right now. The decay spreads over the state, and the sweet smell is a great sorrow on the land. Men who can graft the trees and make the seed fertile and big can find no way to let the hungry people eat their produce. Men who have created new fruits in the world cannot create a system whereby their fruits may be eaten, and the failure hangs over the state like a great sorrow. The works of the roots of the vines, of the trees, must be destroyed to keep up the price, and this is the saddest, bitterest thing of all. Carloads of oranges dumped on the ground. The people came for miles to take the fruit, but this could not be. How would they buy oranges at 20 cents a dozen if they could drive out and pick them up? And men with hoses squirt kerosene on the oranges, and they are angry at the crime, angry at the people who have come to take the fruit. A million people hungry, needing the fruit, and kerosene sprayed over the golden mountains, and the smell of rot fills the country. Burn coffee for fuel in their ships. Burn coal to keep warm, it makes a hot fire. Dump potatoes in the rivers and place guards along the banks to keep the hungry people from fishing them out. Slaughter the pigs and bury them, and let the putrescence drip down into the earth. There is a crime here that goes beyond denunciation. There is a sorrow here that weeping cannot symbolize. There is a failure here that topples all our success. The fertile earth, the straight tree rows, the sturdy trunks, and the ripe fruit. And children dying of pellagra must die because a profit cannot be taken from an orange. And coroners must fill in the certificate. Died of malnutrition because the food must rot, must be forced to rot. The people come with nets to fish for potatoes in the river, and the guards hold them back. They come in rattling cars to get the dumped oranges, but the kerosene is sprayed. And they stand still and watch the potatoes float by, listen to the screaming pigs being killed in a ditch and covered with quicklime, watch the mountains of oranges slop down to a putrefying ooze. And in the eyes of the people, there is the failure. And in the eyes of the hungry, there is a growing wrath. In the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath are filling and growing heavy for the vintage. Did you catch that? The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. The title of one of the most famous books in the American canon came from a passage talking about this phenomenon. What we tend to see in day-to-day life is companies will often conspire to cut back production. They need to get the quantity down if they're going to sell it at a higher price. And we'll talk about that later on when we get to collusion in our competition lecture. But the punchline for now is, faced with bad incentives, if a good is too much of a necessity, it can result in waste. Now, elasticity can have other surprising consequences. With the necessity, the problem was you need to get the price up. And so that can incentivize not producing when people should, or even destroying things that have already been produced. With luxuries, you wind up with a different kind of waste. Instead of too little, you wind up with too much. Here's your scenario. If a good is enough of a luxury, an increase in fuel efficiency, like say gas for cars, can result in more fuel being used. Very bad for environmental policy. We call this a Jevons paradox. See, Stanley Jevons, the British economist who came up with it, was very concerned with coal. It was the Industrial Revolution. Britain was a very smoggy place. All of these factories are running on coal. All of their trains are running on coal. Their homes are running on coal. Coal was the fuel of that world. It still is the fuel of our world, too. It just has to share that status with other things like oil. And it was making Jevons worried. Just like how people used to fear that we would run out of oil, in his day, they feared they were going to run out of coal. We hadn't developed the large coal mines in Appalachia yet. Much of the world was still, it was explored, but it hadn't been explored by geological surveys. Many people believed that industrial Britain would collapse in their own lifetime. And Jevons, he gets to thinking, if you've got a product that's a luxury, then, well, really, let's think about it. From the consumer's perspective, what you care about is the overall cost of the good, right? And some goods are only useful if they go with other goods. What we call these perfect complements. So it's almost like joint supply, but from a consumer's point of view. I would only buy this if I had this other thing to go with it. If I buy electronics, I have to have electricity and batteries to go with it. If I have a car, I have to have gasoline to go with it. It's useless if I don't. Now I care about the total price, the price of all of it together. Now, let's say that activity is luxury. And then the thing is made more fuel efficient. They come up with a steam engine that burns less coal. They come up with an automobile that has a better mileage. It uses less gas. They come up with a laptop that uses less electricity. Because it's a luxury, if it's more fuel efficient, that effectively makes it cheaper for me to use it. And if it's a luxury, then my spending on it's going to go up. Well, if fuel is a big enough share of the cost, or if it's enough of a luxury, then that extra spending on it might come from extra fuel usage so large that it means I use more fuel than I did before. Now, this can be a kind of weird idea to grapple with at first, but I have a simple case. Well, two simple cases, right? We need to contrast them. So, suppose in one scenario that you have a service which requires some additional good or fuel or you know, infrastructure to provide, but the fuel is free to you. I use the example of free internet in cities that provide that. There's more infrastructure that they have to build to support the free internet, but the internet is free to the consumer. And so, if they found a way to provide that more efficiently, if, say, they had satellite coverage for a country that involved less satellites, less launches, and so it was cheaper to maintain the network, or they find a cheaper way to make like cell phone relay towers, well, that's purely going to save resources because it doesn't affect the consumer's indecision. It's free, so they're going to pay the same amount either way. Now, on the other hand, imagine a luxury that is 100% fuel. So I was in the Boy Scouts, and we would go camping, and we had to learn how to build fires and do all of that. And they teach you different ways to make a fire. A good fire, you have to have a backlog, and then you have to have a, kindling, and the kindling needs to be set up in a certain way, and then you put some tinder in there. The tinder lights the kindling, and then the kindling lights the backlog. Well, let's suppose, and we're not bringing our wood with us. We're going out into the woods and finding it. Now, let's suppose that for a Boy Scout troop, they consider campfires to be a luxury. They need their one campfire, but they might build some extra campfires. Maybe they don't all want to camp right next to each other. They've got a lot of conflict in their troop. we did in mine. And then let's say that they learn a newer, better technique for building the fire. Scoutmaster teaches them one. Well, because it's a luxury, and because this technique makes it more fuel efficient, it's cheaper, their spending on the fire is going to go up. But the only thing that goes into the fire is the fuel. The fire is 100% fuel. Which means that if it takes less fuel to make the fire, yet they're spending more on fuel than before, they must be burning more fuel than before. In that worst case scenario, where the activity is 100% fuel costs, if it's a luxury, any fuel efficiency is going to result in more fuel being used. Now, in the end, Jevons's fear was misplaced. He recognized the basic logic of the problem, but what he didn't seem to consider is that coal is not a luxury. You'd think that that would have been obvious. The machines, they either get coal or they don't, right? They either run or they don't. Coal's not a luxury, but gasoline is. So imagine that you run an environmental protection agency like the one we have in the US, and you're very concerned with CO2 emissions. Well, gasoline, generally it's a necessity, right? For the most part, it's a necessity. But even if it's not a luxury enough to have a full-on Jevons paradox, you still know that by making driving cheaper, people will drive some more and they will burn some more gas because of it. So, if you're trying to craft policies, if you're trying to come up with targets for auto manufacturers to meet on their mileage, or you're trying to determine how large the gas taxes should be, then this is something that you have to take into consideration. In other sciences, we call this rebound. I'll wrap it up here. Rebound. A sort of inefficiency that's built in to efficiency saving technologies. So we've talked about demand. What about supply? Now, for supply, elasticity mostly comes down to production lines and alternative sources of profit. So in the short term, can you make easy changes to your production line? Now I told, oh no, I didn't. Okay, well, uh, here's a question for you. Do temp jobs pay more than permanent ones? Well, I don't know how worldly you all are, but I've worked temp jobs before and I can tell you, yes, quite a bit more. And the reason is that when a company hires a worker on a long-term basis, they're relying on them being dependable. But every now and then something comes up. They have to make changes to their line. And they don't have time to go through the normal job search process. They need that worker then and there. And they're willing to pay for it. They can't upscale and downscale their production line as much in the short term as in the long term. And so they're more desperate for workers in the short term than in the long term. The same problem can come up with other things too, like equipment. And it ends up having different implications for different sectors. So agriculture, for example, is going to be a very inelastic sector because you have to plan around a whole year. Now, I'm still imagining an old school farm. If it's like a modern hydroponics farm or a greenhouse, then this isn't going to be as true. But even in those, plants have to grow, animals have to grow. It takes a while to, you know, reap a crop that you have sown. It takes a while to raise a cow from, infancy to adulthood. In agriculture, there's a lot of very long-term planning. And if prices were to go up or go down on a given day, there would be nothing you could do about it. They'll have changed back again by the time you finish a harvest. So agriculture should, as a rule, be fairly inelastic in its supply. Then you've got issues like heavy industry. So heavy industry tends to mean industry that builds other industry, things like steel, cement, uh, production of big machines. Well, often these heavy industrial plants, they involve the use of machinery so large that they have to build the plant around the machine. The machine is built into the basic infrastructure, the skeleton of the facility itself. They might be able to increase or decrease the level of output, but they can't just change the line of work that they do. There might be certain minimum scales. We have to make a batch of steel at least this big for the machinery to work properly in the first place. Or, we can't just double it. We'd have to build a whole nother factory to do that. At the most elastic end would be things like light industry and services. So light industry tends to be your final consumer goods rolling off an assembly line, and services are, well, services. This is where it's easiest. You might have a certain production line, but you could potentially rip out some machines, put in different ones to make a different good. You could schedule your workers to work overtime. You could hire some of those temp agents. And if you're a self-employed service worker, well, you definitely have control over how much you work. Someone like a plumber or an electrician would be expected to have a highly elastic supply. They might have certain hours that they normally want to work, but if the price of their services were to rise dramatically, you can bet they'd be flexible. If someone was willing to pay them 4 times as much, you can bet they'd be willing to work on Sundays and at night and, in all kinds of conditions that they would never otherwise consider. Because the only thing that changes is, their willingness to show up. And elasticity also depends on access to raw resources. If all something needs is just land, just a place to pitch your tent, then it's going to be more elastic. But if production depends on a resource which is more rare, something which is in a very limited supply already, then you're not going to be able to just casually increase output. You'd have to go prospecting first. So things like oil, coal, copper. You would expect both those to have very inelastic supplies, and you would also expect the industries that use them to have inelastic supplies as well. Now, in the long term, supply elasticity is driven more by profits. We have these terms. We're going to come back to them later on in competition. Entry and exit. So entry and exit refers to the ease of getting into and out of a market. If entry into a market is easy, it'll have higher supply elasticity. See, one of the main reasons why we have so many different licenses for so many different types of jobs is it's a way of making the supply more inelastic. So some things like medicine, does it make sense that we have medical licenses? Well, yeah. You have more extreme libertarian types that they want to get rid of medical licenses entirely. Not that you can't have, private businesses do it, but that you shouldn't have to have a medical license to be a doctor. But I think most people, even if they had the choice, they would still pick the doctor that has the license. They'd still pick the lawyer that has the license and so on. Is there any pressing social need to have licenses for crap like barbering and cosmetology? Heck no. That's a pure scam, is what that is. Same as the dang traffic medallions in New York. I don't know if those are even a big deal anymore. They there's a limited number of taxis that are allowed to drive in a lot of big cities. And you would have to buy a medallion. That's like buying your license. You'd have to buy a medallion that certify that you're a legal taxi driver. Of course, some years back, Uber took off and it kind of ruined the market for them. Random yahoos could go and drive people for money after that. But all of that's about excluding people. That's about making it harder to get in on their business so that they have more ability to, jack the prices up. The ability to liquidate your assets, to sell them off, is also important for exit. So barriers to entry, they're going to increase your inelasticity on the entry side of things. Barriers to exit are going to increase your inelasticity on the exit side of things. And nobody likes that, right? But some products, some tools, I mean to say, some capital goods are going to be easier to sell than others. So, for example, if a company is based around providing services, like say they're an IT company, they're a consulting company, they're an accounting firm, they do some kind of white collar job. What kind of equipment are they going to have? Computers, printers, scanners, stuff of that nature. And that's stuff that you can find a market for pretty much anywhere. Even in factories, you still have to have computers and stuff for the offices. You always have the manager's offices, you always have the HR office. On the other hand, if you are in some very specialized type of manufacturing, uh, yeah, there's probably not going to be a buyer. If the price went down and you want to get out of that market because the price went down, well, your fellow producers in that market are also going to want to get out of the market. So it's not going to be easy to find someone dumb enough to buy from you. So the more specialized you are, the more unique your capital is to your line of work, the more inelastic supply will be. In general, both demand and supply are going to be more elastic in the long term, but relative to supply, demand will be more elastic in the short term because producers are stuck with their assets. They can't just easily change their line of work, but they'll be less elastic in the long term. You still need the thing, but that producer can just find a new business. When it comes to time and elasticity, it's a question of how easily can you adjust. People can't just go quit their job and get a new one. Businesses can't just shut down and then start a new business. It's not that simple. But in the long term, well, both consumers and producers can make changes in their lives. But in the long term, the producer can make more changes. They don't have to sell you that good. But the consumer, in the end, their needs are their needs. This is going to be pretty important in Unit 2 as well. You'll see why when we get to things like taxes and subsidies. Has huge implications for who the burden of taxation falls on. Well, in conclusion, this is a conclusion for both of these past two videos. Elasticity is the percentage change in quantity demanded or supplied caused by the percentage change in price. More elastic is going to mean a steeper slope, less elastic, a flatter slope. Necessities are goods that are so inelastic that total spending goes up if prices go up. And luxuries are goods that are so elastic that total spending goes down if prices go down. Demand elasticity is going to be driven by substitutes, and supply elasticity is going to be driven by ease of changing production lines and entry and exit. And supply and demand are both going to be more elastic in the long term, but supply is going to be relatively more so. So now we have all of our supply and demand basics covered. We have an understanding of what the curves are, what they mean, what causes them to move, why they look the way they do. And so the only thing that's left for us is to put them together. And that's where the magic happens. Because when we put them together, we'll be able to see where prices come from in free competitive markets. And then we have a framework. We have our basic model with which we can build the rest of economics. So see you in the next one.